In this exciting episode of the Perry Pod, the lovers might be lazy or suffering from a concussion, and the cash, well, if there's enough of it, let's just call it dollars. Clams is so gauche. It's Season 1, Episode 35 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Lazy Lover. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple. Provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as time permits, I'll look at some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each episode, I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler where, just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the Law Library! Each episode in the Law Library, we return to prior cases to refresh our memories about Perry's past so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. Once again, the case of the lazy lover leads us to a motel where Perry's client proceeds to get herself in a pickle. We're fresh off an episode, the case of the Gilded Lily, where the motel operator actually committed the crime. I thought we'd do a quick survey of all the hotel joints Perry's had to check out over the course of this first season. Spoiler alert, nothing good happens at a hotel. Here's an informal tally. The first murderer in the show's history ran a motel.
Excuse me, where could I find Mr. Bowles?
Why?
I'd like to talk with him.
About what?
I might want a cabin.
In the case of the drowning duck, dirty P.I. Donald Briggs stows his star witness in a Logan City motel and then proceeds to get himself murdered in his motel room.
$5,000 worth within 48 hours. I'm at the Sands Motel.
We get a legit hotel in the case of the Vagabond Vixen when Perry puts the mother of Veronica Dale on his dime up in one during her visit to the big city.
Meanwhile, you're my guest, so just go ahead and have yourself a ball.
Oh, swell. Say, can I start by ordering up a beer? I'm so thirsty I could spit dust.
Help yourself.
Ha swell.
In the case of the runaway corpse, Ed Davenport picks a motel to fake his death inside, and it's based on the motel's proximity to noted Jacksonville State Med School grad Dr. Renault.
He wanted me to find a quack who had an office near a motor court.
A hotel room is the scene of the crime in the case of the fan dancer's horse.
The Rich Mel Hotel, isn't that what Gertie said?
Right.
A motel room is the scene of the crime in the case of the lonely heiress. Ditto for the case of the Gilded Lily, with the bonus that desk clerk Henry Mitchell committed the crime. The case even ends at the motel. A postscript comment. Don't forget that when characters try to bypass a motel, they still end up in a jam. See, for instance, Episode 2, The Case of the Sleepwalker's Niece.
Well, perhaps you could spend the night here. I'm sure Mr. Cole could put you up.
Note to LA tourists. Best to stay at an Airbnb. Also note that motels seem way more dangerous than hotels. Get you a room with an internal corridor. It just might save your life. Now, without further ado, let's get to the plot of our episode. The case of the lazy lover. In a shocker, the marriage between wealthy socialites Bertrand and Lucille Allred isn't going as planned. One source of their displeasure with each other, Lucille's daughter from a previous marriage, Patricia, who it appears may be guilty of the first vehicular manslaughter case in the show's history.
Oh, no. No, you couldn't have hit anyone. Is he hurt badly?
I think he's dead.
But it's all a fake out. It seems that Bertrand Allred, Bertie to his defiant stepdaughter, has set his stepdaughter up. Just what kind of guy is this Allred? a mining tycoon. Here's how his wife describes him.
Well, a woman naturally likes to feel that the man she marries is rather special. At first, anyway. Then to realize gradually, day by day, more clearly, more inescapably, he's cheap, common, greedy, a liar and a cheat, both professionally and personally. Well, it's a pretty bleak experience, Mr. Mason.
Everything comes down to money for Bertie. He senses his wife is going to divorce him and much of her fortune is in community property. He's looking to cut ties with his business partner, and he's hornswoggling him over a new mine discovery. Enter Robert Bob Fleetwood, Bertie's right-hand man and apparent vehicular manslaughter victim.
But if you don't already know this, I hope you will regard it as confidential. My wife has run away with Bob Fleetwood, my secretary.
While Lucille is hiring Perry to defend her or her daughter, Bertie is spinning yarns about Lucille leaving him for Fleetwood? When Perry checks up with Lucille, she says that she, Bob, and Bertie were hiding out in a hotel while Bob recovered from amnesia. Bertie claims it was just Bob and Lucille. Who is telling the truth? Of course, the whole thing backfires on Allred. He winds up dead at the bottom of a ditch when someone runs the car with him in it over a ledge. And Lieutenant Tragg gives us a very detailed description of how the murder went down.
The car was in neutral. Nobody drives down a steep grade like that. Somebody stopped the car, got out, released the brake, and let the car plunge down the grade and through the guardrail. In other words, Fleetwood was murdered.
Lucille gets arrested and Bob Fleetwood snaps out of his amnesia, but not before Della pretends to be his wife.
Robert! Oh, Robert, we were so worried about you.
This? Who is she?
Oh, Robert, don't you remember me? I'm Mabel, your wife.
You are not. I never saw her before in my life.
When Fleetwood admits he never lost his memory, boy, does he have a story to tell.
Mr. Aldred stayed with us at the motel until Sunday night. Then Monday night, Aldred came back to kill me, and I think he was going to kill his wife, too, while he was about it. Anyway, he pulled a gun. He made his wife get into the trunk of the car.
In the trunk?
I know, but he did. He made me drive.
Go ahead.
Well, as we started down the mountain road, we were creeping along, going down grade in low gear. Suddenly, I gave it the gun, then I slammed the brakes on. Aldred was sitting next to me, sideways. It threw him off balance. He slammed into the dash. I grabbed the gun and conked him with it before he could get up.
The case turns on Perry's ability to decipher a map that is initially described by a local tracker who also ran afoul of Bertie Allred. Hamilton Berger thinks the key facts in the case are the woman's footprints that lead to and from where Allred's car was.
Mr. Overbrook, in your opinion, could anyone have gotten from that car to it or away from it without leaving tracks?
Not unless he was a bird.
This interpretation is based on Bob Fleetwood's story that Lucille got stuffed by Bertie in the trunk, a story which Lucille denies.
And weren't yours the woman's tracks found near the car?
No, they were not.
Wasn't this the scheme Robert Fleetwood evolved to implicate the defendant, Mrs. Lucille Allred?
No.
No? Then was it your scheme, Miss Archer?
Perry discovers that it's Bob's girlfriend who holds the key. It turns out it's her footprints, not Lucille's, that mark the track. And Bob is a lot like his boss. And this loaded question from Perry gives us insight into what Bob was probably after in giving the police his story about Lucille being stuffed in the trunk.
Wasn't the real reason you didn't walk out of that motel the fact that you knew there were millions in the True Mining Report? And that you thought there might be an opportunity for you to kill Bertrand Allred and then cheat Stanley Jerome and Mrs. Allred out of their share of this property?
That's not the only misleading information on the map. Perry catches the tracker, Mr. Overbrook, in a lie.
Isn't it a fact that your tracks here and your tracks over here were made at two different times? And that Prince was with you one time and not the next?
Of course not. That's crazy. How could it be when you can see right there that
I'll tell you how it could be.
Mr. Overbrook tries to blame Fleetwood, and we end the main courtroom sequence with another vehement denial, just like the case of the Gilded Lily, rather than an overt confession from the guilty party.
No, that's a lie! That isn't true, that's a lie! He wasn't dead! He was all right!
Perry only gives the ultimate verdict of the case in the denouement.
All right, who really did kill Allred?
Overbrook.
As for the titular lazy lover, just who is that? Let's turn to the novel for an answer. The 1947 novel differs from the television adaptation in a couple of ways. Number one, there's a huge plot at the beginning of the novel about 2 checks and forgery. When Perry gets the initial check from the Allreds, it seems Bertie sent a check that traced his wife's signature so that Mason might cash the wrong one and thus get Mrs. Allred in trouble with the law. Then it's Gertie, not Della, who's asked by Perry to impersonate Fleetwood's wife. Gertie agrees and performs the job with aplomb. And number 3, most importantly, we get an explanation for the novel's title. It's a description of the unconscious Fleetwood, who stays in the car because he's knocked out cold, while Mrs. Allred checks into the hotel to hide out until the smoke clears for her daughter. Fleetwood is lazy because he's letting his supposed mistress do all the work. It makes so much sense now, doesn't it? Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. A Della is something about a particular character in the story. And a Perry is something we learn about our main character. This week's Paul involves the painting that is hanging on the wall of Bernice Archer's apartment.
Thank you, Miss Archer. We just want some information.
So I assumed. Won't you sit down?
Bernice Archer, the hip girlfriend of Bob Fleetwood. I'm pretty sure the painting is Renoir's Girl with a Watering Can. And this episode's research prompt is this: what would this kind of print be doing on the apartment wall of a hip, beautiful 1958 LA woman? Yes, this would be speculative on our parts, but if, say, you found that this was a particular popular print to have, we would know that it doesn't really say much about Archer's taste other than it's conventional. On the other hand, we might have found ourselves a real aesthete and start to see what old Bob Fleetwood sees in her, besides the fact that she tries to help him get off for murder. This week's Della involves Neil Hamilton, a.k.a. Bertie Allred.
Ah, what a welcome sight. May I assume that a share of this pale restorative is for me?
Born in 1899 and initially a shirt model for magazines before he turned to acting, Hamilton was a star in a 1923 D.W. Griffith film called The White Rose. And after he landed a star contract with Paramount Pictures, he was Nick Carraway in the first film version, albeit a silent one, of The Great Gatsby. When the sound era came, he starred in a bunch of Tarzan films, though he was never really in any blockbusters. It was all B pictures for our man Hamilton by the time the 40s rolled around, and then the bottom dropped out. According to a 1970 interview, Neil said it was his Roman Catholic faith that gave him the strength to continue his acting career when it was at his lowest. And he did renew that career, mostly in television. Of course, he's best known for his 3-year stint on Batman as Commissioner Gordon, a role for which he really dressed like Bertrand Allred, except he worked for the good guys.
I haven't decided yet, Batman. With your approval, I'd like to think it over. No choice is easy in a case like this.
I agree completely, Commissioner.
Yes, and he worked alongside Yvonne Craig, his stepdaughter in this episode of Perry, and Yvonne Craig played his actual daughter on Batman.
I'm in Commissioner Gordon's office. No one else is here. I must speak to Batman at once.
Apparently, according to an interview conducted by Jim Davidson, neither Yvonne Craig nor Neil Hamilton initially remembered having worked together on the Perry Mason episode when they met a decade later on Batman. All told, Neil Hamilton starred in 7 episodes of Perry Mason. We'll see him next in Season 2, The Case of the Dubious Bridegroom. He died in 1984. This week's Perry displays our intrepid hero's desire to keep his legal sparring partner Hamilton Berger guessing. Why not simply tell Hamilton who the real killer was?
Berger had it right the first time. I just couldn't bring myself to the point of agreeing with him. Might establish a dangerous precedent.
This is a fun subplot of Season 1, tracing the relationship between Perry and his nemesis Hamilton. Score another one for Perry. The theme for this episode is motherly devotion. This episode plays a little like The Case of the Desperate Daughter in reverse. In that episode, the stepmother and stepdaughter had a surprisingly close relationship that contrasted with the icy relationship the daughter had with her biological father.
Now, isn't that funny? After all those fairy tales you hear about the wicked stepmother, no one ever did as much for me.
There, the real dad commits the crime that lands his biological daughter in jail. Even worse, the father committed the crime because he thought, wrongly, his wife was having an affair. In the case of The Lazy Lover, we have a real mother and daughter bond over against a stepfather who ends up dead. Who picked Lucille up at the hotel? Patricia. Who matters more than anything in the world to Lucille? Patricia. We've seen mothers sacrifice for their daughters before. Mrs. Leeds killed for her daughter in the case of the baited hook, and Virginia Dale had a swell mom in the case of the vagabond vixen. What this means is that in Perry's world, while marriages, voluntary unions between unrelated people, are often short-lived, blood ties can be more permanent. Now it's time for a Perry proverb.
She's my daughter, Mr. Mason. She's the only thing in the world I care about.
After getting Della to impersonate Bob Fleetwood's wife, Perry has just turned the supposed amnesiac over to the police. Trag and Perry discuss the fact that Perry doesn't often play nice with the police. And Perry tells Trag he wants the record to show that this time he cooperated. Perry's response is priceless. Or rather, it's justice that's priceless. As Perry shows in the denouement, he's willing to make the prosecution pay for their shoddy work. Their poor job of prosecuting crimes has its cost, and when Perry can, he's going to stick the state with the bill. Now, let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
In view of certain past accusations, Lieutenant, I'd like this instance of my cooperation with the police duly noted. Remember, I turned Fleetwood over to you.
Oh, would carved in stone be satisfactory, or shall we etch it in bronze?
Whichever is more expensive.
Our research prompt last episode involved fingerprints, as we wondered whether or not the requirements for points of similarity for fingerprint identification had increased or decreased since 1958.
There is one thing I don't understand.
Go on, Paul.
Here's the big takeaway. There is no universal standard for points of similarity.
As you can see by these photos, I've listed 15 points of similarity. In court, you only need 12.
The FBI demands at least 12. In the UK, you need 16. And in 1992, the International Association for Identification said that the minimum required points of similarity was up to the expert. Wow. Well, the 15 points of similarity worked for Paul and was proved to be accurate by the fact that Mrs. Brent confessed to having been arrested for a crime. There you go. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this episode you'd like to comment on or something that you'd like to correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com, or email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. All PerryPod episodes are now available via Spotify and YouTube, as well as iTunes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Join us next time where things get crazy. A divorced couple still loves each other, and a mother will not mourn her own dead son? It's the case of the prodigal parent. Join me, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying keep on walking that Park Avenue beat!